It's so nice to look at and see so many friends and friendly faces here. I want to thank you all so much for joining us today for this panel discussion on analyzing Ukraine through the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which is co-hosted by the New Lines Institute and by the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy Alumni Association of DC. My name is Emily Prey, and I'm the director of the policy portfolio here at New Lines. This event follows New Lines' groundbreaking research on Russia's breaches of the Genocide Convention in Ukraine, multilateral asset transfer and reparations for Ukraine, and lessons from Bosnia on conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine. As for the last one, many of you may know that I co-authored the report on CRSV in Ukraine, Lessons from Bosnia, with Dr. Kinsey Spears and Tanya Doney that was published last year in an effort to continue bringing attention to the crime of sexual violence and conflict, and especially putting the issue at the forefront with policymakers around the globe. You can find copies of all the reports on the table, so please take them. And so without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our opening speakers. First, we have Ambassador Markarova, who's here with us today, who's the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States. And it's an honor to have you join us. Thank you so much. Giving remarks after Ambassador Markarova is Ambassador Gupta, who is the fourth ambassador at large for the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues at the U.S. State Department. Thank you both for being here today. Ambassador Markarova, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emily. Dear Ambassador Gupta, dear Emily, dear Kallie Mitchell, dear distinguished panelists and guests, and most importantly, so many young women in the audience. First, let me extend the heartfelt gratitude to the Institute for addressing the conflict-related sexual violence and really shining a light on this heinous war crime. So this very difficult topic, actually, by the Russian forces. Today's event, it's also very important that you can share this report with everyone here, not just reports from Ukraine, but also lessons learned from Bosnia. Because as we all know, justice anywhere is a threat to justice, as Martin Luther King said. And while discussing horrible war that Russia wages against us, we have to be very vocal about all other violations, all other conflicts, because we either get to the justice everywhere, or there will be threat to justice everywhere again. Today, unfortunately, marks 845th day of the full-fledged phase of this war, while the war actually started 10 years ago. And unfortunately, we continue to uncover the Russian war crimes everywhere in Ukraine, including the sexual crimes, including all types of actually war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression to start with, because it's Russia that started this unprovoked, unjustified war in 2014 and then increased it to the full-fledged war in 2022. Now, whatever numbers you hear from us, and General Prosecutor's Office is putting out official numbers of the cases registered, 130,000 cases of war crimes, hundreds of cases of sexual violence. All these numbers are definitely understating the true scale of the atrocities, because unless we liberate all Ukraine, we will not know the full scale and full size of these atrocities. But yet, you know, every time we liberate a village, every time we liberate part of our territory, the first thing we learn is this, unfortunately, the horrible scale of the crimes. And this disturbing pattern we have seen before. We have seen these patterns of atrocities by Russian forces in Chechnya. We have seen it in the Republic of Georgia after the invasion in 2008. We have seen it in Ukraine. We have seen it in Syria. We have seen it in other places where either Russian forces, official forces, or Wagner groups, or anyone else was involved. And unfortunately, the lack of punishment for this led to this impunity with which they started anywhere. Now, this, in our minds, is a much broader picture. The fact that they are committing war crimes, the fact that they are illegally deporting Ukrainian kids, kidnapping them, and this is the horrible crime for which Putin has been indicted formally, together with his commissioner Belova, by the International Criminal Court. That all constitutes a genocide, trying to eliminate Ukraine as a nation, trying to eliminate our culture, trying to steal our future, trying to kill as many Ukrainians. So the Ukrainian civil society organizations, like the Center for Civil Liberties, who probably you all know, which is led by Oksana, our Nobel Prize winner, who is in Kiev actually today, and I just saw her this morning. And when she was talking about, of course, first and foremost, human rights and violations of war crimes, she also said, and she repeated what she said in Berlin last week when we had this big reconstruction conference, that Ukrainian women deserve not only compassion and assistance as victims of war, but also respect and true gender equality. And this is very important to keep in mind as we talk about war and conflict and horrible atrocities, but also to remember, and there are so many great women who said the right things about it. I'll just quote Condoleezza Rice, who said, we need to move beyond the idea of girls can be leaders, but create expectations that they should be leaders. And we all should be guided by this principle. Ukrainian women are not just victims. They're victims because of horrible war, but they're also true and fierce defenders of their own future and their children's future. And the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which we're discussing today, is very much vital for Ukraine and very important to discuss it right now. We always underscore that we have to win this war. This is the only way how we can stop the war crimes, stop the aggression, and win the war, but we also have to win the peace. And again, another great woman, Hillary Clinton, said that there can be no true democracy unless women's voices are heard. There can be no true democracy unless women are given the opportunity to take responsibility into their own lives. And again, this is what Ukrainian women are doing today: resisting, providing help, fighting on the front lines, showing the leadership, commitment, raising children together, and helping each other. We have 67,000 women in the armed forces today, included at the front lines. This is one of the highest numbers of women, and we actually lifted, unfortunately because of war, all the restrictions for women in the armed forces. Now, I mean, this is one of the, I wish we were talking about women in other areas, but when women want to defend their country, there should be no restrictions, and we don't have them now. The recent survey of the Ministry of Digital Transformation shows, and they did a very wide survey of what is the typical entrepreneur of Ukraine right now. And it's a 36-year-old woman. 56% of businesses in Ukraine now are founded by women, which highlight the significant economic impact of women, not just the traditional ways, not just something outstanding like fighting on the front lines. So beyond entrepreneurship, women continue to play active roles in their communities. In some communities where more men, of course, than women went to defend on the front lines, raising children together, shaping the next generations, taking care of each other, and also learning new skills. Right now, we see that the reconstruction of Ukraine will require so many professions and so many people will lack, and we see women increasingly participating in STEM, in different working professions, everything that needs to be done by Ukrainians in order to rebuild our country. So I just want to add by saying we would not be able to do it ourselves. It takes a village, as you know, to raise a child, but it also takes a global village to help any country at horrible war and a situation like Ukraine is now. And I just want to thank Ambassador Gupta for all your tireless efforts in this field, in this area, supporting women in Ukraine, supporting equality in Ukraine, fighting for this tirelessly. But the State Department, together with DOJ, is doing enormous work also fighting for justice, together with the Prosecutor General, not only documenting crimes, but actually prosecuting crimes together, not only in Ukraine, but outside of Ukraine. And hopefully soon we also will work together on the tribunal on aggression, not only to stop our war, but to deter other wars, to send a very big signal to aggressors who tend to be not women. Women do not start wars usually. That starting an aggressive war is a crime for which they will be punished regardless of the outcome of the war, now when we fight for the war. So with that, it's a big honor and pleasure to be here with you. Thank you, Institute, for all the wonderful researches, and please do more, because we need to share these lessons learned with everyone and to protect and defend women, all people, justice, and dignity everywhere. Thank you very much and have a great discussion.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Our next ambassador,
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emily, for the introduction, and thank you to the New Lines Institute. It's my first time here. It's a pleasure to be here, and to the Fletcher Alumni Association for inviting me to speak today. I'm honored to be here with Ambassador Markarova, who's, since the day I took this position, I think a week later, I met with you, and I've always been impressed by the amazing leadership that you offer Ukraine and your longstanding championing of the rights of women and girls around the world and in Ukraine. So let me start by reiterating the United States' unwavering support for the Ukrainian people in their fight to defend their democratic country and its chosen future, as you just saw in all of the events that just occurred last week at the G7 and beyond. Indispensable to that support is our commitment to promoting the rights, protection, and well-being of women and girls inside and outside of Ukraine. I'd like to use my time today to expand on these two inextricably linked lines of effort, and specifically how we can leverage the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security to achieve a just and durable peace in Ukraine and in all of the other conflicts and crises that we are experiencing around the globe. But let me start by zooming out a bit. As we approach the 25th anniversary of UNSCR 1325, we have made great strides. There are now over 107 countries with national action plans on WPS, with more opportunities for partnerships across governments, civil society, academia, and the private sector. And through the adoption of the Bipartisan WPS Act here in the US in October 2017, the United States became the first country in the world with comprehensive legislation on WPS. I have to say, when I travel, I brag about that a lot. Last year, the United States released the updated US Strategy and National Action Plan on WPS, and our implementation plans are forthcoming this summer. As the world grapples with what is the largest number of conflict, last rate of conflict since World War II, all of which, as we well know, have disproportionate impacts on women and girls, I would argue that advancing the WPS agenda is more important than ever. And the fact of the matter is that after almost 25 years, our implementation efforts on WPS have still not reached their full potential. And that's what I've been quite impatient about. Because what happens next is really up to us. With sustainable peace hanging in the balance, the international community must dedicate the resources needed to make WPS a central avenue to tangible peace and security. Because it can be and it should be, but we're not there yet. To fully realize its promise, WPS must be deployed as a framework for our security partnerships and programs. WPS must also be utilized as a lens through which we view existing and future conflict. In fact, the Georgetown Institute of Women, Peace and Security recently released the first of its kind conflict tracker that helps us do just that. And we just heard from the ambassador examples of women from across Ukraine coming together to fight for a just and durable end to the war and a rebuilding of peace and security efforts in Ukraine. Women like the 2023 International Women of Courage awardee, Yulia Tyra-Payevska, who demonstrated extraordinary moral and physical courage in defending Ukraine against relentless Russian aggression by providing frontline medical training in the Donbass, evacuating women and children from Mariupol, documenting war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russian forces in Ukraine, and bravely enduring torture and abuse during her 3-month detention by Russian forces. We need to support women like Tiara, acknowledge their courageous contributions to humanitarian response and accountability, and give them a voice. But it is these women who understand the needs on the ground, who personally experience the pain that comes with conflict, and who have overcome tremendous adversity with great sacrifice, upholding the cause of freedom, justice, and accountability. It is by listening to and supporting these women that we make the commitments made in that UN Security Council resolution and our WPS national action plans actually come to life. In Ukraine, my office is working in close coordination with local women leaders and civil society organizations to connect directly with women on the front lines to understand their needs and support the elevation and amplification of their voices. More specifically, we're supporting Ukraine's updated strategy and national action plan on WPS, which highlights the importance of recognizing women as vital contributors to Ukraine's resilience and defense and to the future recovery of their country. I'm impatient for that full implementation of the commitments we have made and that we as governments have recognized have value in ending conflicts and bringing about justice. Mainstreaming the core principles of WPS, the safety and meaningful participation of women and girls across our efforts to address conflicts and crises, that is the capacity we have to build. Ensuring we have the tools, expertise, and organizational capabilities required to deliver on our commitments to women and girls by looking inward, honestly assessing where we have fallen short, and making the hard decisions to correct course and do what we know must be done. The urgency of building that capacity is particularly important given the impunity with which conflict-related violence, or what we call CRSV, persists across conflicts globally. We've come together today in commemoration of the International Day for the Elimination of Violence in Sexual Violence and Conflict on June 19th. And we can't talk about effective WPS efforts in Ukraine without addressing those atrocities and abuses that are committed against women and girls and men and boys by Russia's forces during this war. To support survivors of CRSV and all forms of gender-based violence in Ukraine, the Department of State manages a $4 million project to advance survivor-centered approaches to justice and accountability by offering survivors and local GBV service providers a range of support services to help individuals and communities recover and thrive. In partnership with local civil society and women's rights organizations, the activities supported through this project include updating referral pathways, improving psychosocial support services, performing outreach to survivors and their communities, and enhancing their capacities, the capacities of national authorities, services, and institutions to deliver survivor-centered and trauma-informed care and pursue survivor-centered approaches to peace and justice. We need more of these kinds of approaches and services to address the needs of survivors of CRSV, but we also need to work together. And I've begun to talk about this as much as I can every time I have access to a podium. We need to work together to change the narrative of the inevitability of sexual violence in conflict. For too long, women's bodies have been the battlefield on which wars are fought. Rape and other forms of sexual violence are not a winning strategy in any war. They are crimes and shameful tactics that do nothing more than expose the weakness and desperation of the perpetrators. That is the message we must all communicate forcefully. Conflict-related sexual violence exacerbates conflict and does not prove strength or power. Returning to what I said at the beginning, the United States is committed to supporting the people of Ukraine as they defend their freedom and their future. To meet that goal, the women of Ukraine must be active participants in any decision-making in this conflict. They must be at the center of security, recovery, and stabilization efforts. This war cannot be won, and lasting peace in Ukraine cannot be achieved without them. As we work together to put WPS into action, let us all have the courage, in the words of Tiara, to act for the sake of the future generations and the idea of freedom for the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Markarova and Ambassador Gupta. Welcome to the New Lines Institute. I'm Kallie Mitchell, Gender Policy Analyst here at New Lines, and I will be moderating the panel today. We really appreciate our audience for taking the time out of your day to join us to analyze Ukraine through the Women, Peace and Security agenda. I'd also like to thank our co-host, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy Alumni Association of DC. As we gather today to discuss the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the context of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, it is essential to understand the foundation and significance of the WPS agenda. Established by the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000, the WPS agenda underscores the role of women in conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and in peace building, while also highlighting the disproportionate impact of conflict on women and girls. In the case of Ukraine, the WPS agenda offers a vital framework for addressing the gender dimensions of this conflict. Since the onset of hostilities, Ukrainian women have been at the forefront, not only as victims of violence, but also as leaders on the front lines in humanitarian response, in peace advocacy, and in community resilience efforts. Today, we'll explore how Ukraine can leverage the principles of the WPS agenda to navigate the complexities of its conflict and to work towards a sustainable peace. As we begin our panel discussion, I will introduce each panelist and pose an opening question to them, moving down the line before going back into a second round of questions, and finally we'll finish with an audience question and answer. Our first panelist is Khrystyna Kit, head of JurFem, a Ukrainian Women Lawyers Association. Khrystyna is an attorney at law and a PhD in law, and also a coordinator of the experts group on CRSV in Ukraine. Khrystyna, how can Ukraine leverage the Women, Peace and Security agenda as a strategic tool for conflict prevention?
Dear colleagues, I hope you hear me well, and I thank you for invitation, and I have the pleasure of participating in this event and discussing with you the role of women, peace and security agenda in our policy, especially if we talk about conflict-related sexual violence. Of course, National Action Plan 3025 is a strategic document and is a part of the CRSV implementation plan in Ukraine and our national gender-based violence policy. In our work, it is very practical and living document, and we are working with this document not only on national level, but we have a coalition of 3025 in 19 regions in Ukraine that localize women, peace and security agenda. It is very essential, especially during wartime, because we have different security situation in different regions in Ukraine, and we have, of course, different challenges in each region. First, our National Action Plan was adopted in 2016 during the war, and now we have a second National Action Plan. This National Action Plan was adopted in 2022 and since the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine. Of course, this National Action Plan was updated, and together with the Ukrainian government, with civil society organization, we updated this National Action Plan. The updated National Action Plan until 2025 takes into account the challenges associated with full-scale invasion, including the large number of internally displaced persons and women with children who were forced to leave Ukraine, and the increase in the number of women in the armed forces of Ukraine. As Ambassador mentioned, as of today, near 67,000 women serve in the armed forces, which is 40% more than in 2021. Also, there is an increase in the number of women veterans. In addition, the updated National Action Plan includes responding to cases of gender-based violence and, of course, include conflict-related sexual violence measure. Regarding the Women, Peace and Security agenda as a strategic tool of conflict prevention. It is difficult now to talk about implementation of strategic document as a way of prevention. in a world where the human rights are not a value for individual states. In particular, in the situation of Russian war against Ukraine, when part of the territories are occupied, and according to the Prosecutor General, one war crime is committed every 10 minutes, it is impossible to talk about prevention. But in the global context, one of the aspects of prevention and global peace and security is to ensure women's participation in peace-building process, negotiation process, and women's access to decision-making. Until there are people of different genders, different gender identities, social and ethnic groups, etc., at the negotiating table, we will continue to face the new security challenges. And this is one of our tasks at the national and international level in the context of implementing the current National Action Plan City 25 and working on a new National Action Plan. I don't hear you, sorry, colleagues. Maybe you unmute your microphone.
Thank you, Khrystyna. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Robert Nagel. Rob is a senior research fellow at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security at Georgetown University. Rob, can you speak a bit about the role of masculinities in the conflict?
Hi. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Kallie. It's a pleasure to be here. I could spend probably 2 days talking about masculinities and the roles they play in the conflict, but we don't have that much time. And I don't think anyone else wants to talk about this for 2 days. So I'll keep it short. And I'm going to focus on 2 connected issues around masculinities. The first one being sort of the expectation for men to serve in combat and the draft instituted by Ukraine. And the second issue I'm going to touch on is men as victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And they're actually connected in multiple ways. Some of the things I won't be touching on is the role of masculinity in Putin's war of aggression and the bigger question of great power competition and how masculinities shapes that. I think that is a worthy conversation to have, and I think a strategic point of intervention for the women, peace and security agenda going forward. But as I said, we don't have enough time. So, as I assume all of you are aware, Ukraine instituted a draft and essentially also banned men from leaving Ukraine because everyone was supposed to serve. And that is somewhat problematic from a masculinities perspective, completely understandable in the context of a war of aggression and defending one's country. The problem from a researcher perspective that I see is that it reinforces a gender division that posits men as combatants and women as civilians. And with that, it reinforces certain gender stereotypes around men linked to violence, men as strong, men as powerful, men as protectors. Because gender is relational, that warrior masculinity requires sort of a feminine opposite, the peaceful, the nurturing, the caring women and girls, women as civilians. We've heard 67,000 women are serving in the armed forces, and that's great. That doesn't negate the issue that the values underlying that are sort of masculine values, right? And so the challenge is there is, what are we doing with men who are pacifists, who don't want to fight, even in the context of this war of aggression? And if they fail to live up to the masculine expectation of serving in combat. And second, what about women who want to serve in a fight, but cannot because they are being pushed into a caring, nurturing, traditional role because of the draft that takes their husbands. And so maybe they want to fight, but they can't because they can, as you said, like 67.
Their men are not drafted, just,
Oh, okay,
it's all mandated.
okay, all right. So while this appeal to a word masculinity is understandable, as I said, especially in the context of defending against a war of aggression, it harbors a societal danger in increasing militarization and idealizing certain masculine values, as I said, around violence, around strength, around power. And that has several potential negative consequences. And one of them relates specifically to my second point around men as victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. By positing men as warriors and emphasizing strength and power and all these notions, it makes it so much harder for men to come forward as victims and survivors. It exacerbates the feelings of shame and stigma. And overcoming that becomes incredibly difficult, right? The second related point around elevating these masculine notions is it becomes really difficult in the post-conflict space to make room for women's inclusion, or to make room for women's inclusion in the conflict context writ large, because women have to basically prove their masculinity, living up to the values of strength and power, all these values that we have elevated by putting men as the defenders, as the natural protectors. So men's natural protectorness is assumed, and women have to prove theirs. And so we're putting sort of masculine values above feminine values, and masculine values get associated with men and masculinities, whether that's true or not, and women have to prove theirs. And so that becomes really difficult to unbind and destructure and deconstruct, especially in the post-conflict context. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much for those insights, Rob. I'll now move to our final panelist, Emily Prey, Director of Gender Policy at New Lines Institute. As Ambassador Gupta mentioned, on Wednesday, the international community will commemorate the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. Could you talk a bit about how Russia is using conflict-related sexual violence as a method of war?
Thank you, Kallie. Thank you everyone for being here today. And Rob, I would stop for 2 days. I know you did that last week also for a masculinities discussion. So sexual violence has nothing to do with pleasure and everything to do with power. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, there have been reports of sexual violence being used by Russian affiliated forces against Ukrainian citizens of all ages and all genders. Women especially have faced extensive sexual violence during this conflict, and they reported being gang raped, having their families be forced to watch Russians raping them, being branded by soldiers after their rapes, being held as sexual slaves, and being raped until they are pregnant, and often told by their rapists that they, the soldiers, want Ukrainian women to bear Russian children. All of these acts are deliberate methods to subjugate the survivors and further break down societal norms and bonds. One important component of rape as a weapon of war is the sense of social cohesion and bonding that the act itself provides for militaries that are not cohesive or have used force to recruit their fighters. And the Russian military famously is relying heavily on convicts, conscripts, forced recruitment, foreign fighters, and mercenaries. These groups of people may not have a strong sense of belief in the cause of the invasion. And so they have a higher likelihood of participating in sexual violence and conflict. Gang rape in particular creates a bond of cohesion among soldiers who do not have a shared background or the same allegiance, towards an ongoing war. I want to highlight two groups of survivors of CRSV that are not often mentioned. Rob mentioned one, men, and also children born of wartime sexual violence. So when we discuss both of these groups in my report on conflict-related sexual violence lessons for Bosnia, we did research on both of them. I worked with Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General while researching and writing the report, and the data that they've gathered and continue to gather shows that men are victims of sexual violence and conflict, especially male soldiers while they're held in detention. And if we're looking at the data that's being gathered, these numbers are increasing alarmingly every month. In Bosnia, where we can learn many lessons and we can draw a lot of parallels, men were also similarly raped and subjected to sexual violence in conflict and while they were detained especially. But they've only just started coming forward to speak about their experiences now, decades after the war. One male survivor from Bosnia speaking about the sexual violence that he suffered said, "You carry it inside you like a bomb." We need to do better so that all survivors of sexual violence and conflict, including men, including people of all genders and all ages, don't feel like they're walking around carrying bombs inside of them, so that they can come forward, they can receive help and justice and don't have to wait decades to do so. And it's a testament to Ukraine that everything that your country is doing in the midst of conflict, I mean, you really are being held as a standard of how to address sexual violence and conflict at this point. There's still so much more to be done, but the fact that Ukraine has a unit in the Prosecutor General's office on conflict-related sexual violence, is coordinating with the Pamela Patton's office at the UN, is coordinating with so many allies on conflict-related sexual violence is really a testament to Ukraine. For children born of wartime sexual violence, this is a group that's talked about even less. In Bosnia, it's estimated that 50,000 women were raped. That is, again, just women, and very likely the tip of the iceberg. We can be sure there are so many more. The real figure is much higher. From this, an estimated 2,000 to 4,000 children were born of wartime sexual violence. This was a critical component of the Serb campaign of genocide against Bosniak Muslims. I'm sure many of us may be familiar with the rape camps they set up with the intention to forcibly impregnate Bosniak women, who would make them stay there, and then it would only release them after it was too late to abort the fetus. Children who are conceived from sexual violence and conflict face extensive socio-cultural barriers to social inclusion, potential discrimination, and legal hurdles for full representation. When we look at Bosnia, we can see a positive example. In July 2022, in Brčko district, they passed legislation giving legal representation to children born of wartime sexual violence as victims of war. In July 2023, the Federation Parliament extended these services and benefits for all Bosnian victims of war, which now include these children. I say children, they're adults in their late 20s, early 30s. But this was done at the advocacy of the children, now adults themselves, led by the Forgotten Children of War Association. This is the first time in Europe that any country has passed a law like this. But these children, now adults, they had to find themselves. They did the grassroots work themselves, and were able to create this change. And it's really incredible, but look how long it took, 30 years. We know that Russia is using sexual violence and conflict in Ukraine. We know that children have been born, are being born, and will continue to be born of wartime rape. So Ukraine should start putting in place protection for these children now, so that we don't have a situation like Bosnia, where 30 years onwards, they're still fighting against the stigma that they face in society and fighting for protection. And lastly, I just want to make one point that while I am talking about conflict-related sexual violence, my report is about conflict-related sexual violence. CRSV is one component of larger sexual and gender-based violence. Sexual violence doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens on the continuum of violence. Before Russia's invasion, there was gender-based violence occurring in Ukraine. The perpetrators were just different. And we can be sure that there still is gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, domestic violence happening in Ukraine. Likely the war has exacerbated it, It might not be a very popular thing to talk about, but I bet that the victims of domestic violence and intimate partner violence would like us to talk about it. It's not just Ukrainians who are suffering as well. A recent study done in Russia showed that Russian soldiers who returned home from the war, those households where they were returning to, where there hadn't been any reported domestic violence and intimate partner violence, they're now seeing spikes in violence. So it's important to zoom out and to see the larger picture of the repercussions and the blowbacks from this war on civilians in Ukraine and in Russia, and use the tools that we have that are readily available to us to prevent further sexual and gender-based violence from occurring. One of those tools is the Women, Peace and Security agenda. It's really rare that an agenda has so much global support and global buy-in, but over 100 countries have national action plans on WPS. It's an agenda that's continually evolving and has decades of research backing it. It's such a waste and such a shame that so many people, especially policymakers, don't know about it, don't know that it exists. So it's up to everyone in this room today, whether you're just learning about WPS or whether you have already been working on it, go and spread the good word of women, peace and security, not just in Ukraine, but in all of the work. You can apply it, I promise. Kallie's our expert, you can ask her afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thanks for bringing up that important point about continuum of violence and addressing the permissive environments that perpetuate gender inequality and gender-based violence in peacetime and lead into conflict and in post-conflict as well. So returning to Khrystyna, I'd like to discuss the future of Ukraine's WPS National Action Plan. Given that the current National Action Plan ends in 2025, and with JurFem's involvement, what key elements do you hope to see in the next iteration of Ukraine's National Action Plan on women, peace and security?
Thank you for this question, but first I want to add a few words to previous discussion about men and women who are survivors of CRSV, because it's mean in our future plan we have to include these aspects. First of all, if you talk about official statistic, of course, in Ukraine, now we identify near 300 CRSV cases. These cases identified by prosecutor office, and 100 of these cases, it's a situation where men are survivors of CRSV, and 180 cases which committed against women who are survivors of CRSV. And we, as an organization who provide legal support for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, what we see now that we need different approach if you talk about men and women who are survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Because, for example, for men who are survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, for them, very important talk not about sexual violence. Usually they talk about torture. It means when we analyze our legislation and prepare amendments to our legislation, and when we work on reparation mechanism for survivors of CRSV in Ukraine, we have to include this component and think how we must talk with men who are survivors of CRSV. If you talk about women who are survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, of course, most of them, maybe not most, but many of them now don't live in Ukraine, yes, because when territory was deoccupied, for example, in Kharkiv region, in Kherson region, many of women who are survivors of conflict-related sexual violence left their city and now live abroad. It means that we need now think about referral mechanism between Ukrainian authorities and international authorities, between Ukrainian civil society organization and international organization who work with Ukrainian survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in other countries. And it's very important aspects if we talk and think about new National Action Plan 3025. Of course, as my organization, Ukrainian Women Lawyers Association, JurFem, we work with National Action Plan including gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence aspect. We are working on a few areas. First of all, it's advocacy. We provide gender-sensitive expertise on the legislation and draft law about gender-based violence or conflict-related sexual violence. We preparing amendments to our legislation and helping our state authorities implement the Women Peace Security Agenda, implement the Istanbul Convention and EU standards if you talk about the survivor-centered approach in sexual gender-based violence cases. And it's very important component because Emily mentioned about conflict-related sexual violence as a component of sexual gender-based violence in general. And it's very important to remember that we cannot implement survivor-centered approach only in CRSV cases. We have to think about gender-based violence in general and gender-based violence as an ordinary crime and implement survivor-centered approach in these cases too. Together with my colleagues, we coordinate the expert group on conflict-related sexual violence and the Prosecutor General Office and try work not only with CRSV unit but with gender-based violence unit too, and together with national and international experts, we try to reply to different requests from the security and defense sector if we talk about CRSV and GBV. Together with our state authorities and civil society organization in Ukraine, we helping our executive government to respond to CRSV and create a reparation system for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Next very important component, and this component we have in National Action Plan 2, it's about education and strengthen the capacity of the legal community, in particular attorneys at law, prosecutors, investigators, to respond to sexual violence, including conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based violence, and implement survivor-centered approach in these cases. When, of course, we and other Ukrainian organization, we will work on new national action plan next year, and we need to continue to work on developing program for women veterans and women who work in security sector and build a system of social support and rehabilitation for these women. Another important aspect in the context of combating violence against women and ensuring women's participation in decision maker is to strengthen women's economic independence. And of course, an important part of the work will be the implementation of measures to protect and restore the rights of victims of war crimes, including conflict-related sexual violence. The Women Peace and Security Agenda is an international agenda, and it's very important to have a common platform within which to build a common vision of the implementation of Resolution 3025 and to formulate joint activities at the international level in this area. Because as Russian war against Ukraine has shown, security challenges are not just a matter of one state. They are a global threat to the human rights, and the role of women and women's participation in decision-making at all levels is essential. And it's very essential to communicate together with different women's movements in different countries and together build this Women Peace Security Agenda and implement this agenda together. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Khrystyna. Rob, building on your earlier discussion and wondering if this will also take 2 days, how can the understanding of masculinities be operationalized to foster peace in Ukraine?
It could take 2 days, but again, we don't have that much time. Yeah, so building on what I said earlier, I think there are a couple of things that are really important, especially as we think about the post-conflict space and sort of the transition period, transitional justice. So if we think about DDR or disarmament and demobilization and reintegration programs, it's really important to implement and integrate masculinities lens in that process, especially around deconstructing this warrior masculinity ideal of it's about power, it's about force, it's about protection, right? And we've had a recent research project at the Institute in 3 conflict-affected contexts. And what we found is, based on survey work with more than 6,000 participants, that there's a strong preference for nonviolence amongst men. They rate it as like one of the most important qualities of being a man. And so leveraging that preference for nonviolence and really helping the transition into civilian life is important. And the other part that we found in our research project as well was around leadership roles in peace building processes and access to roles of public authority and who is perceived as a leader. And what we saw there is what I alluded to earlier, that men's leadership is often assumed as natural and given. And so every role of public authority is seen as either more suitable to men or equally suitable for men and women, but never as more suitable for women than for men. And so deconstructing that is really important in the DDR process. So getting away from sort of the hierarchy of masculine values on top and feminine caring, nurturing, all that as sort of subordinate is really important. And because we have that sort of rule of thumb bias where we say masculine men, those values are assumed natural and women have to prove theirs, it becomes so much harder for women to take these leadership roles. They have to prove themselves over and over again, right? And so deconstructing that is really important. The other part in that that's been mentioned as well around conflict-related sexual violence is the trauma, right? The post-traumatic stress that survivors and victims and their families feel, and deconstructing notions around masculine strength there is really powerful too. Like, you don't have to be strong. You've been violated. You were vulnerable. You are vulnerable. All of that is like, this is real. This has happened, and getting away from that sort of warrior masculinity there is an important step. And so the importance of psychosocial services and getting men into that cannot be overstated, because, as mentioned, the spikes in domestic violence and intimate partner violence, we have seen that it's well documented across the globe. Conflict areas see that even years after. And so if we want to protect women, if we want to help women, if we want to empower women, we need psychosocial services to help that reintegration. And let's stop there.
Great, thank you so much. I think you make a really big, important point about the psychosocial support. I think Philip Schultz wrote about sexual violence against men as a forced segregation of the masculine self. And so destigmatizing those notions is really, really important for psychosocial services and healing trauma. Turning to Emily, considering the issues that you discussed, what specific policies should the US and the international community be working to adopt to support Ukraine effectively?
I think the first, maybe the most important one, and probably we all know this, is taking a survivor-centered approach. Just ask survivors what they want and what they need. Different groups of survivors are going to need different things. People of different ages will have different needs, people of different genders, and coordinate with pre-existing NGOs and CSOs. I mean, JurFem is in Ukraine doing incredible work. So they have the trust and buy-in of local communities. Why set up something totally new when there's already a lot of organizations doing this work already? Secondly, the McQuaggy Foundation has a guidebook on state obligations for conflict-related sexual violence that was published a year or two ago. It's a great resource for us all if you want to know what your country's obligations are under international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and the WPS agenda. The guidebook has compiled all of the applicable international law and norms relating to conflict-related sexual violence. Number 3 is using universal jurisdiction.
states have a logical and a moral duty to use the principle of universal jurisdiction in their own national courts and laws to bring perpetrators of CRSV to justice on behalf of Ukraine. We've seen this work successfully in Bosnia. Recently, in 2022, a court in Montenegro confirmed the indictment of Slobodan Krčić, who was a Bosnian Serb war criminal who raped several Bosniak women and girls in Foča during the war. Several European countries have opened investigations into Russian war crimes in Ukraine, but more countries should follow. The Clooney Foundation for Justice launched their Justice Beyond Borders initiative, which includes a global mapping tool and allows you to check what kinds of universal jurisdiction restrictions countries have for genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. However, only about 20 countries in the last 30 years have used these laws to initiate cases. And again, to repeat, when we're thinking about justice and accountability, ask survivors what they need, because everyone is always, I think in the international community in particular, is really keen on international legal justice mechanisms. And they are important and they do have their place, but we can't put all our eggs in that basket. If we look at Bosnia, there was an estimated 50,000 women raped. And yet in total, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, accused 161 individuals of sexual violence. The court ultimately charged 78 individuals, but finally only 32 were convicted. So while the ICTY produced historic international jurisprudence with respect to conflict-related sexual violence, it also showcases how incredibly difficult and rare, not to mention how costly and lengthy these processes can be. National justice systems also cannot be counted on as the only form of justice. They are important and they're needed, but we can't focus solely on that. I was in Sarajevo in September, and I was invited to the sentencing of 4 alleged war criminals who were Bosnian Serb police officers. I was sitting with the victims and their families who had been fighting for decades to see this justice play out in court. And I was sitting with the families and victims as 2 of the men, including the chief of police who led the other men in committing war crimes, were acquitted. These families waited 30 years for this justice, and in one moment it was all taken away. So there really needs to be diverse and creative and survivor-centered efforts for justice and accountability that go beyond international legal justice mechanisms. And lastly, I have to talk about the Women, Peace and Security agenda. That's what this whole event is about. It's a tool, as I said before, and as other panelists have said, it's a tool for policymakers to ensure that when Ukraine wins this war, when there are peace talks, women must be included. All the research shows that when women are included meaningfully in peace talks, these peace is longer lasting, more durable, and more sustainable. Survivors of conflict-related sexual violence should be included as well. In Bosnia, the Dayton Agreement's construction of multiple governments that were purposely decentralized has had the effect of weakening the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina and undermining human rights throughout the country. Women and survivors of sexual violence in that war were completely excluded from the talks, which instead focused solely on issues of ethnicity and territory. By excluding survivors of sexual violence from meaningful participation in the peace talks and ignoring the prevalence of conflict-related sexual violence in the gendered manner in which Serb forces waged their war and waged their genocide in Bosnia, often using women's bodies as battlefields, the peace negotiators missed a key opportunity to address some of the root causes of the war. So I really think that if women survivors of CRSV had been included in those talks, we might not be seeing conflict brewing in the Balkans like we are today. So when we look at Ukraine, we want a peaceful future for Ukraine, and that cannot happen if women are not included and if survivors are not part of that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your insightful contributions and the interesting discussion. We've covered a lot of ground. So now I'd like to open the floor to audience questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and Kelsey will be going around with the mic. So, yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gordana Richardson, and I'm coming from a Center for International Private Enterprise. I won't be saying anything about economy here because I am coming from Serbia. And prior to coming here, I actually worked for Women in Black, which is an anti-militarist feminist organization that actually worked across the whole region of the Balkans and former Yugoslavia, and connecting with different women's organizations and survivors in working in the area of transitional justice. And my question is, because I've seen a lot of, well, I was working for Women in Black and going and talking to the survivors in the whole region of former Yugoslavia, especially Croatia, Bosnia. I visited a lot of war camps where the crimes were committed by the Serbian forces. And I saw power of kind of, and that's also kind of part of the psychosocial support, which is very, very important for the survivors. When the kind of people that are coming from the perpetrator nation are visiting the war camps and former war camps and talking to survivors and their families, it was very important for them that we were there to listen to them about what happened. And it was kind of a curing for their kind of, as a part of transitional justice, kind of symbolic reparations. That was a kind of the reparations that was offered by us. And I was trying to advocate from 2010 to 2015 for the survivors to kind of be recognized in Serbia as civilian victims of war, because in Serbia, the law doesn't even recognize not only Serbian survivors of wars in Bosnia, Croatia, but also like none of the survivors of sexual gender-based violence, they cannot get reparations in Serbia for the crimes that were committed to them by any forces, and especially largely number of women among them. And I would have a question for you, because as a Serbian person that worked in the kind of transitional justice, Women in Black, and connecting with other women, are there any organizations between like, or bridges between Ukrainian women and Russian women, especially Russian organizations in Russia that are working on these issues, like Women in Black? I think that this kind of support is important, not only because they can advocate for these laws within Russia, but also they can provide what kind of we try to provide, which is like going to places where the war crimes happen, talking to the survivors and kind of trying to advocate for their rights and be their voice inside of Russia as well. So that's kind of what we were doing and trying to support. So are there any initiatives being kind of known about this that I've tried for myself, but I didn't really find information on this. So if you have information, please share it with me. And I just want to say that I didn't succeed to like change the law in Serbia from 2010 to 2015 as a part of the Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan advocacy. But I really hope that in the future we'll be able to change that law, and all the women who survive sexual gender-based violence can get reparations in Serbia from the perpetrator state as well. So yeah, that's my question. Are there any initiatives? I had to give a little bit of background to it.
Khrystyna, maybe you have something to say in response to that?
Yes, I will try answer on your question. Maybe I'm not sure that I correctly understood what you mean, but if you talk about reparation for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, and especially if you talk about symbolic reparation for survivors of CRSV. Now in Ukraine, we work on a draft law about interim reparation for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And of course, we try implement not only compensation as a form of reparation, but we try implement other form of reparation for survivors of CRSV, include symbolic reparation. But now we do this during the wartime, and of course, usually we work together with Ukrainian civil society organization and international civil society organization, and we don't have any communication or cooperation with Russian civil society organization, and we don't know any Russian civil society organization who now can say that they know about war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide which committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine. And I did not hear any official information or not official information from human rights defenders from Russia who, for example, now live abroad, that they understand what Russian soldiers do in Ukraine and which crimes they and atrocity and crimes they committed and against Ukrainian citizens in general. And now I don't believe that we will have in the near future any organization from who work in Russia or Russian organization who will say that yes, our soldiers, Russian soldiers, and our Russian government committed genocide, crimes against humanity, and other war crimes in Ukraine. I think it's only my opinion, but maybe my colleagues from human rights movement have some contacts with human rights defenders from Russia, and they try help Ukrainian citizens, but I don't know this information.
I just have a few quick comments for that as well, Gordana. On the topic of that you were speaking with survivors and the victims and that was helpful. I heard a story from Dr. Marie Berry, who works on conflict-related sexual violence and women's rights after war. She was doing her PhD research in Bosnia, and she this was several years after the war had ended, and she was speaking to some survivors of sexual violence, and they said that there were all these different efforts, desperate efforts by NGOs, by the international community government, to kind of address justice and accountability. But the one thing that was the most helpful for them was Women for Women International funded a trauma-informed massage therapist for these survivors of sexual violence. And, you know, rape and sexual violence, it's a violation of your body. You aren't in, like, touch becomes very traumatic. And to be able to have someone trained in a trauma-informed way of how to do that, they said that more than the ICTY, more than anything, like that one massage did more for them over the course of many years. So it really is, you know, creative ways to look at interim reparative measures are really important. And secondly, I think language is really important when we're talking about any conflict. I try to never say the Russians are doing this. It's Russian forces, Russian soldiers, the Kremlin, Russian affiliated forces, because the Russian people aren't the Russian government. And there are probably quite a few people in Russia who do not support the war, but aren't able to say anything or do anything. The same in Serbia in the 90s. And thirdly, I don't know about conflict organizations in Russia working on conflict-related sexual violence, but I do know on the topic of the forcibly transferred children from Ukraine to Russia, there is an organization in Ukraine doing kind of the majority of rescues, Save Ukraine, and they do coordinate with some Russian individuals and some Russian organizations. I don't know who they are or what they're called for their safety, but they are working with a couple people on the Russian side to help bring the Ukrainian children back. So there are some organizations.
Thanks so much. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Nagel. Okay, it's good. I was at the State Department for 5 years and then went to Fletcher and am now heading back to state, which also, and it's nice to meet you in person. And I'm wondering what I found in my first 5 years at state was that we had a hard time breaking the silo between people who worked on WPS and then people who worked on hard security. And we were working really hard. But at that point, just to like, I guess, highlight the intersectionality of everything related to human rights post George Floyd was when we at state and domestically, I think, had like a real wake up. And so there was
again, that's kind of when those efforts took off, but it was really volunteer heavy, and it was mostly women volunteering. And so I'm wondering in the, I guess as, I think, yeah, I mean, Ambassador Gupta being here speaks to how far maybe the department has come in 2 years even, but how do you all see that silo or how those silos affecting the integration of WPS kind of work with traditional warfighting like bureaucracy and, you know, even well-intentioned people working on their own kind of avenues of work just don't speak each other's languages. And so how does that, like how have these two worlds actually come together to try to get maybe traditional security people to start like implementing this or thinking about this in the way they operate and talk every day and vice versa?
Hi, nice to meet you. It's interesting you ask that question from a state perspective. Usually we get the question from a DoD perspective. Yeah, I think what I've heard from friends in the DoD space in particular is framing WPS as a national security issue, and like that line, women, peace and security is a national security issue, like opens doors. And then it's just about like demonstrating the case of like, how is this a national security issue? Domestically, you can think about personnel and readiness, how sexual assault within the US military is a massive problem, right? But as I said, if we think about great power competition, we should think about gender. We should think about masculinity. And so it's about finding sort of the language that resonates, because the issues are very clearly hard security issues. I actually don't like the hard soft security distinction. It doesn't make sense to me. But yeah, it's about finding sort of the language that translates and resonates.
You have the language. You have an example. Can you help us?
Well, we can have
I also, there are several, I wish I could pull up some of my friends at the State Department who I'm looking at right now, and maybe you can chat after. But one of the things that we do at New Lines with the gender policy portfolio, and you can see, you know, some examples of our reports there, is trying to incorporate more gendered analyses, gender intersectional analyses in these spaces, and trying to speak the language that someone else is speaking. So for example, if I'm talking to someone in the DoD, then framing WPS and incorporating gendered analyses as a way to have, for the US to have more effective fighting force, that might, I don't necessarily want us to like be building up our army, and I have, you know, different thoughts about the military, but like if that gets you in the door, then that, I think that's what's important. And I will often try to just Trojan horse gender into whatever conversation I'm having. And oftentimes gender, unfortunately, can be a polarizing word these days. And so women, peace and security being, you know, an agenda that is almost 25 years old now. People have heard of it, they do know about it. And there's so many different ways that you can frame it, from looking at prevention to looking at, you know, protection and all the pillars that we have there. But yeah, we can definitely chat afterwards of different ways of framing things.
Great, I think that is all the time we have. Thank you to our panelists and thank you to the audience for coming, and there is lunch being served over there, so please stick around. Thank you.
Thank you.